From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's 12 exchanges and 6 clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
As we're sitting here in the library today, the partial government shutdown continues. It's clearly taking a toll on the 800,000 federal workers who have missed their first paycheck. But for those who keep their eye on the podium of the New York Stock Exchange, looking for which company is celebrating its initial public offering, it's taking a toll on the IPO pipeline too. You see, over at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal agency that must approve corporate paperwork for IPOs, most of its 4,400-person staff is furloughed. The lawyers who pore over documents, setting the stage for those nail-biting hours on the floor of the NYSE, can be found somewhere in D.C. or the nearby counties of Virginia and Maryland, idling away their days while companies waiting in line to tap liquidity in the markets have to wait and wait and wait. I know what it feels like to idle away days on a furlough from a shutdown. Back in late 1995 and early 1996, when I was working at the White House, I was sent home during the standoff between President Bill Clinton and House Speaker Newt Gingrich over funding for Medicare, education, the environment, and public health in the 1996 federal budget. 2 successive shutdowns in that period lasted a combined 26 days, a record never matched until now. The issues of 1996 and 2019 may be different. We're now talking about a border wall rather than the budget. But the drama is very much the same. In fact, the way tribalism among political parties evolved and played out in the 1990s, pitting a president against a House Speaker and the officials who lined up in their respective camps, wrote the script for what we're watching play out every night on the news today. One leading newscaster who's reporting on the ramifications of Trump's shutdown and how it may affect the 2020 election has gone back and dissected the decade of Clinton and Gingrich, Mario Cuomo and Ross Perot, and Al Gore and George W. Bush as the prelude to our current mess. Steve Kornacki, National Political Correspondent for MSNBC and NBC News, is out now with The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism. Our conversation with Steve right after this.
Cushman & Wakefield is one of the premier brands in the commercial real estate services space. We have 48,000 professionals around the world in 400 offices in 70 countries. This company, 101 years old, if you can imagine, it's never been public. There's a reason they call the NYSE the big board. It's a great home for companies like us, big companies with big ideas. Cushman & Wakefield, now listed on the NYSE.
Few people alive today understand how the counties of Maryland and Virginia, with all those furloughed federal workers, to say nothing of those in Ohio, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado, where a lot of federal workers and members of the military also live and work, might vote their views of the shutdown at the polls next year than our guest today, Steve Kornacki. If you watch MSNBC or Nightly News or the Today Show, you've seen Kornacki crunching the numbers in real time. Sleeves rolled up, khakis slightly wrinkled, pacing in front of a digital scoreboard, drilling down into counties whose names most struggle to pronounce. Steve has an encyclopedic knowledge of how they all add up, in the case of a presidential election, to 270 electoral votes. For those of a certain age, Steve's passion for politics recalls a man he watched growing up near Boston, Tim Russert, the legendary host of Meet the Press, who used a whiteboard and dry erase markers to make many of the same points Kornacki makes with the touchscreen. And when the technology fails him, Kornacki is quick to fall back on the Russert-style whiteboard to keep doing the math. We don't have a whiteboard here in the library, but we have Steve. Welcome inside the Ice House.
Thank you. You know what? We should just ditch the board. I think it fails so much and go with the whiteboard. That's not a bad idea going forward.
When I've seen you having to go to the whiteboard, you do just fine.
It's more natural when you think about it, and actually it doesn't fail in the same way that the board just flickers out sometimes.
If my math is right, Steve, you were a lad of 16 when Clinton and Gingrich shut down the government in 1995, and yet you reconstruct it in such riveting detail in the red and the blue. I know where I was passing the days along with my fellow furlough workers drinking margaritas at L'Oreal Plaza. What are your recollections in that pre-MSNBC era of what you were seeing back then at 16?
I was in high school back then, and I was into politics. I was following it, and I did not have many points of reference, going back more than 2 or 3 years at that point. But what I remember is the media coverage was that this was, from the instant it happened, this was a huge event. This was a momentous event. It was a traumatic event. It was certainly covered that way. And I think what the media and political world kind of it took from that, or the way they approached it, was with urgency. There had to be a resolution of this pretty quickly. There was going to be a winner. There was going to be a loser. This was going to be decided. And I think back on that now, just what that one felt like as a consumer of news, I guess, back then, and compare it to right now. And I guess that's the thing, to me, a generation later, that's clearly missing here, is that same sense of urgency.
When Echo gave you the opportunity to write a book, and you've got a big brand now, you could have written about anything. You could have written about current Trump, more recent Obama, the George Bush years. Why did you go back 30 years to do the 1990s?
I guess there's, in some sense, it may be because it's sort of my point of entry, and it's become a reference point for me. Just as the years have passed, I've always found myself looking back at those sort of foundational moments in the 1990s, where I first kind of learned about politics, and I can always compare. Here's what I remember from 92. How does it look different in 2004, 2008, 2012, whatever point we're talking about? So I think I always just had a sort of a natural connection with it. But also I'm very interested in, I would say, modern media age political history. Going back a little further, my political memory begins in the early 1990s, but I think, anything from sort of the late 60s on, I'm just very interested in.
No one roots for a government shutdown unless you've got the House Speaker and the Senate Minority Leader on your sofa at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And yet, for you and your book, timing is impeccable for comparison to 23 years ago. Here is President Clinton from November 1995.
The government is partially shutting down because Congress has failed to pass the straightforward legislation necessary to keep the government running without imposing sharp hikes in Medicare premiums and deep cuts in education and the environment. It is particularly unfortunate that the Republican Congress has brought us to this juncture because, after all, we share a central goal: balancing the federal budget.
Balancing the federal budget seems like such a wistful goal.
and think about it. We said the wall now. The big thing back then, it was Medicare. I think that was the one that stood out above anything else. And that shutdown had been building all year, 1995. You had that first Republican Congress in 40 years. You had Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, who, he was a gadfly when he first came to Congress in the late 70s. And this was somebody who, at the start of 1995, as Newt Gingrich is taking over as the first Republican House Speaker since the 1950s, he's got to be thinking there's a part of him that feels every political instinct he's ever had has been validated. He took the Republicans to where even Republicans didn't think they could get control of the House. And there he is taking over the gavel from Dick Gephardt at the start of 95. And from that point forward, it's building to the shutdown because Gingrich's political instincts, the ones that have just been validated on the grandest possible scale, are telling him this is where Clinton's vulnerable. This country is fundamentally anti-government. This country thinks the government spends too much money. And if you get into a shutdown with Bill Clinton over the welfare state, over Medicare, in the name of balancing the budget, you will win. You'll finish them off. You'll finish the modern Democratic Party off. And Gingrich took that confidence into the showdown with Clinton. And you can hear in that clip you just played, Clinton was just as confident that if he stood that ground, he would prevail politically.
Did you see the Clinton affair last year on A&E?
Yes.
I'm curious, as you're trying to reconstruct the images and sights and sounds for your book, your thoughts as you looked at all the atmospherics and aesthetics in that archival video.
Yeah, well, part of it was trying to figure out how to tell the story, because there's obviously so many things we know now that we didn't know as it was playing out. And the decision I made in the case of the shutdown and in other parts of the book was try to recreate the story as an American in that moment would have absorbed it and processed it. So that means something like the intern who Bill Clinton might have been encountering during the shutdown was left out in that moment.
The A&E documentary focused on the White House. What did you learn as you wrote was going on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue?
It's funny because I talk there about the confidence that Gingrich, brought into that confrontation. I should say that the fuller context, though, is that already, this is, we're talking November, December 1995 right here. Already by that point, Newt had taken a lot of political blows. He was always a loose cannon. He would always, get have these inflammatory statements that they would just come out of his mouth. And for 16 years, from 1978 to 1994, he was a member of the minority party in the House, the permanent minority it was thought to be. So folks in Washington knew who he was. He had a reputation with people in Washington. No average person knew who Newt Gingrich was. So he would say these things, and people in Washington they were numb to it by 1994. Then all of a sudden, in the 1994 election, there's a Republican revolution. It's a bigger night than anybody had imagined for Republicans, and this guy's going to be a Speaker of the House. And for tens of millions of people, it's the first time they've ever heard of Newt Gingrich. And he starts talking this way, the same way he's always talked. And now every one of these inflammatory utterances becomes a major news story. And he finds himself on the defensive. And so his popularity had really taken a hit. There he is, the government, he's in these negotiations with Bill Clinton. They go over to Israel for the Rabin funeral, and he just muses to the press. This is the way he always talked, seeming to say, I didn't get treated the way I wanted to on Air Force One, so maybe this shutdown's going to, go on for a while. It couldn't have been a bigger political gift
New York
to Bill
Post
Clinton.
has a field day with it. Crybaby and
Chuck Schumer. Then he was a Democratic congressman trying to make a name for himself. This famous press conference, he blew up the front page of the New York tabloids, and it's Gingrich in the diaper and everything. I think he was holding a rattle, and I'm watching Schumer try to give Trump the same treatment now, and I say I know where he learned that from.
And that's where I wanted to go next, because when the story of the current shutdown's written, what kind of picture will be painted of what's going on in today's West Wing and down Pennsylvania Avenue in Schumer and Pelosi's office?
What feels different this time is I get the sense, especially among Republicans, they're sitting there saying, are we sure we're paying a huge political price right here? And you look at Mitch McConnell in the Senate right now, who I think, in the past, certainly if you look at the McConnell of 1995 in Washington, he was on the side of those Senate Republicans, I think, who was hoping to get the thing resolved. I think they've been through several. I think Republicans remember 2013 in particular and say, there were predictions that 2014 would be a massacre for them because of the shutdown, and it wasn't. And you just look at Trump and look at everything that Trump managed to get away with, essentially, that no other politician would have on his way to the presidency. And I do think there's just this question there of, if you're a Republican, it doesn't look that good for us. The polling isn't great, but it's never been great for Trump. Is it that much worse? I think they're asking themselves that question, whereas in 95, and I mean, especially with that Rabin funeral comment, but also just in general, there was an understanding among most Republicans in Washington right away. The politics were breaking against them on the shutdown, and they needed to find a way out. And it became this battle. Ironically, it was the freshmen, it was the revolutionaries who wanted to keep going, and it was Newt who created that revolutionary freshman class, who even he could see what was happening and was trying to walk them back from the ledge. That's what ended up happening in 95.
And yet today, I'm always interested when I'm in a grocery store checkout line in upstate New York, very different from here in New York City, and you overhear conversations of people and they are cheering the president on. They're happy that he's sticking it to the people who infest the swamp, like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. So there's a sense that we are, in a bubble here in New York and not seeing the way the rest of red America in the red and the blue today think.
I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot to that. Just the challenge of trying to understand politics after November 2016, I would say, is that so many of our assumptions, and I mean the sort of political consensus, media political consensus, so many of our assumptions about you must do this as a candidate or a president to be popular. You can't do this and win an election. So many of them are blown up by the experience of Donald Trump that when you get into a situation like this, you start to question, okay, 49% say blame Trump, 32% say blame the Congress. That's about what the numbers looked like. That was about the split in 95 in the shutdown. The Republicans were on the losing side of that in 95. That sent them into a panic in 1995. you look at it now in the wake of that 2016 election, and you're a Republican, you say, do we really know what these numbers mean?
Let's go back to the 1990s and the red and the blue. The C-SPAN archives must have been a permanent, bookmark on your browser as you went through from 1988 onward.
What an incredible resource that is. For folks who don't know, they've basically taken everything that's ever aired on C-SPAN and they've made it available online, searchable. You can play the video ad-free. C-SPAN, I'm always one of those C-SPAN junkies. I've never been one of the callers, but all the callers are always, the first thing they say is thank you for C-SPAN, and I feel the exact same way. It's just an incredible resource. And yeah, that's one of the reasons I say I like modern media age politics, is because that's an important component in shaping politics in modern time, is how these things look on television, the pictures, the images, what it sounds like to people. And you can, on C-SPAN, you can go back. A couple of the moments in the book I went into great detail kind of recreating. Obviously that's C-SPAN playing a key role there. But that's that's sort of the in modern politics, part of the story is understanding how these things looked to the viewer on television.
In Chapter 6, you go back to 1990. The GOP standard bearers, George Bush in the White House, Bob Dole in the Senate, Bob Michel in the House. Against the backdrop of his no new taxes pledge 2 years prior during his campaign, you write, and I quote, "The play seemed obvious to Bush. Break the taxes pledge now. Take the hits, endure the jokes, pay the political price, then reap the benefits in 92. Here he was in the Oval Office delivering a speech to the nation.
Tonight, I want to talk to you about a problem that has lingered and dogged and vexed this country for far too long, the federal budget deficit. Thomas Paine said many years ago, "These are the times that try men's souls." As we speak, our nation is standing together against Saddam Hussein's aggression. But here at home, there's another threat, a cancer gnawing away at our nation's health. That cancer is the budget deficit.
Bring us through the maneuverings on the deal that led up to that night in the Oval Office, a kind of bipartisanship, as you write about in The Red and the Blue, that's now all but extinct.
Right, and the deficits had exploded in the 1980s, and the key there, of course, was that Bush in the 80s was Reagan's VP. And Reagan was the tax-cutting Republican president. Reagan bought into supply-side economics in the late 70s. It was, at the time, kind of a revolutionary theory. He bought into it. In campaigning against Reagan in 1980, Bush called it voodoo economics. And he said it would explode the deficit, and he was against Reagan's plan. Then Reagan makes him his VP, and Bush can see that the party's changing. It's Reagan's party. Bush spends the 1980s trying to convince the Reagan wing, I'm really one of you. And he really wasn't. Bush, what you saw in 1990 is what George H.W. Bush actually was. Those were his instincts when confronted with a national debt. At that point, it was reaching $3 trillion. I think it had crossed $3 trillion. It was going to explode, hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And his instinct, his real governing instinct, once he was in the Oval Office, was, we got to make a deal here. We got to make a deal with the Democrats. They control the Congress. They're going to want to raise taxes. That means I've got to raise taxes. I'll try to keep it as minimum as I can, but I will do that. And we're going to cut some spending here, and that's how we're going to cut the deficit. And if we cut the deficit, the economy is going to steady itself. I'll get reelected in 1992. Those were his real instincts. But when I say the party had changed and become Reagan's party, that was real. And that's what Newt Gingrich, at that point the number 2 Republican in the House, that's what he embodied. He was serious about that. He was serious about, we don't raise taxes as a party. So Bush cuts the deal. He expects he's going to take some heat. What he doesn't expect is what he gets. The number 2 Republican in the U.S. House, Newt Gingrich, party leadership. I'm not with you. And there's a rebellion. And the Republicans, the Gingrich Republicans, kill it on the House floor. Comes for a vote, they kill it. And Bush is humiliated. And of course, as he says, he's massing troops in the Middle East at that moment. He's humiliated. He has to go to the Democrats and he has to cut a brand new deal. And it's basically all on their terms. They pass it more with Democratic votes. He signs it. And the killer, if you will, politically for Republicans is 2 years later, okay, you put this big tax hike deal through. The economy was what knocked Bush out of office in 1992. It's the economy, stupid. Remember the Clinton thing? And so the lesson Republicans took, even the pragmatic Republicans, the lesson they took out of that episode was Bush took all that political heat, he got his tax hike, and it didn't even help him. And the economy tanked. And so I think that is when I say that's a big moment. That's what I mean, because a generation later, Try getting a Republican vote in Congress for a tax hike. That's the origin story of it right there, I think.
I mean, you write about the retirement of Bob Michael, and here comes this player from nowhere, congressman from Georgia, House Minority Whip. I've got a clip of him roasting Pat Buchanan, another big player in your book, at the Spina Bifida Association in 1991. Let's hear it.
To be here with Mark Shields and Pat Buchanan. Shields and Buchanan are essentially perfect for this kind of a roast because they're basically twins. They're soulmates in life. They're classics. They represent the tuxedo-wearing charity roast inside the Beltway working class. Reagan only seemed like an actor compared to these two. They have made a fabulous living with great incomes out of the equivalent of professional wrestling.
Having fun at the expense of Shields and Buchanan, partisan squabbles still seem like a bit of a show, but Gingrich was about to make it real.
That's so funny to go back and listen to, in part because that captures something I think important about Gingrich in that moment. I say 1991, that is. He's number 2 House Republican. He has been gaining influence on the Republican side for more than a decade. Again, he was the laughingstock. If he was anything in his early days in Congress, he was the laughingstock of the Republican conference. They did not take him seriously. He had all these grandiose ideas about history, his importance to history. And there he is in 1991, and that is what he's kind of describing in the joke there. That's a real big inside the Beltway event right there. Media, political players. And that's Gingrich at that moment was simultaneously transforming congressional Republicans into a much more populist, spirited group, a group that embraced the idea of political combat, partisan warfare, fight the Democrats on just about everything, don't compromise on anything, spell out clear differences with them. There's that Newt, but he was also in that moment, a key difference between the Newt then and now is he was, I don't want to say embraced by the establishment, but he was comfortable in it, and they were comfortable with him, and he was a character in the establishment. And that was where he was in the early 1990s, and right up until he becomes, obviously, into his speakership. And then when he leaves Congress and leaves, that part of his career, he becomes, a full-fledged anti-establishment, not just in rhetoric, but in terms of his life. So to continue our chronology, we're approaching the 1992 election, and maybe Bush's gambit with the budget deal will pay off, but the economy's in this tailspin after the Gulf War, as you said. If it's just Bush against Clinton, those two, who wins, based on your electoral analysis? I honestly believe it's Bill Clinton. I think the margin looks about the same. I think the electoral map looks about the same. There might be 1 or 2 states that flip. I think the thing that's forgotten about Perot, the independent who gets about 20% of the vote in 92, it's remembered that there was a lot of overlap between his style and his politics and Pat Buchanan's. And Pat Buchanan had challenged Bush in the primaries that year, got a little over 3 million votes. So it is absolutely true. And I think it's very true, particularly of the Perot folks who stayed loyal after the 92 election. And he created this United We Stand movement, and they had local chapters. The folks who really got involved in that tended to be Buchanan-ish. But to get 20 million, close to 20 million, votes, about 20% of the vote in 1992, you need something broader than that. And we forget the other sort of currents of discontent that were out there. Jerry Brown on the left, 4 million votes on the Democratic side, calling the system corrupt, trying to blow it up. Paul Tsongas, Democratic Party, runs against Clinton in 92, pro-business liberal, pro-Wall Street liberal. That's what Tsongas called himself in 1992. There were a lot of Tsongas supporters who didn't like Bill Clinton, who ended up voting for Ross Perot, because Perot's big issue was the deficit. That was Tsongas' big issue. Tsongas said it was a moral issue. It was a generational issue. It was pro-business. Perot was pro-business deficit. So there was a lot more overlap than just Perot and Buchanan. And the test, to me, the ultimate test is Perot, there were 2 phases. He ran in the spring of 92. He kind of cracked up under the media spotlight and dropped out of the race. When he gets out of the race, it's the Democratic convention. First polling out there has Clinton ahead by like 20 points. Clinton stays ahead all summer. Republican conventions held. Clinton is still ahead. Labor Day, Clinton's up 10, 15, 20 points. Bush never leads in a single poll. And at the start of October, Perot gets back in the race. And the race actually gets a little closer in October. But again, Bush never led in a single poll. With Perot in the race, at the end or without him in the summer. So that tells me it was a broad coalition that was with Perot, and I think the race is the same no matter what.
You said you're a student of politics and also a student of political media as it evolved, and well before Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, Keith Olbermann, or Rachel Maddow, there's Larry King and the platform that he offered to anyone who would sit across from him and his suspenders on the CNN set. And one of them was this businessman from Texas, Ross Perot. Here is that first appearance he had on King, February 20th, 1992.
Let's go down to grassroots America where the people are hurting. And everybody's saying, why are we in this mess? First thing I'd like you to do, all of you, is look in the mirror. We're the owners of this country. We don't act like the owners. We act like white rabbits that get programmed by messages coming out of Washington. We own this place.
Is there any scenario in which you would run for president? Can you give me a scenario in which you'd say, okay, I'm in?
Well, number one, I don't want to.
I know, but is there a scenario?
Number two, you know, if you're that serious, you, the people, are that serious, you register me in 50 states.
Larry King, huge influence in the 1990s, the platform to launch the Perot campaign. What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, just think about that, too. It's like it's so easy to, I feel, when we look back, to lose sight of how much the media culture has changed in the generation. There is no internet, basically, back then. It's a primitive internet.
Nothing.
There is no social media, right? There's no Facebook. There's no Twitter, okay? There's no cable news except CNN. And it's not, you don't have partisan cable news or anything. So you got 9 p.m. Larry King. You want to make news, you got Larry King at 9 and Ted Koppel at 11:30 on ABC. Those are your two choices. What that set off, I think, would be extraordinary at any point in history. But I think it's particularly extraordinary when you consider what I just said about the lack of the kind of viral media we now have. He said, I don't want to do it. Register me, put me on the ballot in all 50 states, and I'll do it. From that, you had it was a genuinely grassroots movement that sprung up. People organized themselves. Again, you know, almost without an internet, people organized themselves around the country. That was February 1992. In May of 1992, you had the first major state ballot deadline, Texas, huge state. And the rules in Texas were you basically need to get 250,000 signatures to get on the ballot. They submitted well over the volunteers, well over 250,000 signatures. Perot makes the ballot in Texas. He goes 10% in the polls, 20% in the polls, 30% in the polls. There are polls by the late spring in 1992 that have Ross Perot in first place, 40% nationally. He's beating the incumbent president, George H.W. Bush, who he hates, by the way, and who hates him. And Bill Clinton, the soon-to-be Democratic nominee, is like left in the dust, 25% of the vote. Perot is in first place. He's on the cover of all the major newsweekly magazines. They really mattered back then. Mm-hmm. And there's these scenarios where it seems very possible this election is going to get thrown to the House of Representatives because no one will get 270. But at that point, there's electoral maps that are out there that have Perot clearing 270 and winning the election. We have seen third-party candidates.
He's got Hamilton Jordan. He
brings in Ed Rollins.
Rollins.
Yeah, right. And that was there. Ed Rollins, who had done Reagan's campaign, Hamilton Jordan, who's done Jimmy Carter. He brought them both in. Looks like it's going to be a really serious campaign. And that's when I say he sort of cracked up under the scrutiny. That's what started to happen. He wanted these political professionals to be associated with him. When they tried to exert control over him in the campaign, he bristled at it. They bristled at that. They both left the campaign.
Sounds like a guy we know.
It really, and that was, what did they call it? There was, I forgot who it was, but there was a journalist who called Perot the world's first populist billionaire. And that's very much what it was. He's a billionaire. He was quick with these folksy expressions. He railed against the establishment. He talked about these stupid bureaucrats in both parties in Washington, D.C. There were strong populist undercurrents, like we were saying already in '92, and he was positioned to tap into them with this sort of implicit promise of, I'm worth billions of dollars. I know what I'm doing. These guys in Washington, I eat guys like this for lunch. You send me there, I'll fix it. That was essentially what Perot was running on in '92.
But Clinton gets through. As you write in Chapter 14, and I'm quoting now, he'd come to power facing a unique challenge. Never before had so many Americans had so many doubts about the character and integrity of a president that just elected. For the opposition party, there was an opportunity in this, and it meshed with a particular component of the Gingrich playbook. What was that component?
Gingrich believed that there was a majority. It's sort of the old concept Richard Nixon had with a silent majority. It was rooted in a lot of ways on cultural issues, on a backlash to the liberalization, if you want to put it that way, of American values that came out of the late 1960s. He called the Clintons at one point, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Gingrich did, he called them counterculture McGovernicks. George McGovern, the 1972 Democratic presidential candidate, it was Pat Buchanan who came up with that amnesty, acid, and abortion, to sort of stand for what McGovern represented. And Newt said that's the key. You make any voter in a country, no matter where they are, see the Democratic Party as the party of counterculture McGovernicks, and they will vote Republican, and you'll win the presidency, you'll win the Senate, you'll win the House, you'll win everything. And that was his theory.
And in many ways, and we've seen this pattern repeat itself, but I was certainly there at this moment. In the early days of the Clinton White House, they sort of dug their own grave. I mean, here's Dee Dee Myers, the press secretary, at her daily briefing, May 19th, 1993.
We've been looking at a number of different operations within the White House as part of the National Performance Review headed by the Vice President. We've been looking at the different functions within the Office of Administration, and last week we began to take a look at the Travel Office. Within the Travel Office, we found sort of gross mismanagement, if you will. There's basically very shoddy accounting practices, mismanagement, a number of things. And in order to correct those, we thought it was advisable to take immediate action. And so the previous staff has been dismissed.
I mean, you can feel her reticence, can't you?
Yeah, it sounds very defensive, doesn't it?
I mean, Whitewater and the suicide of Vince Foster followed. Dan Burton isn't a name on the tip of our tongues nowadays, but how did he become a thorn in the Clinton side throughout the 1990s?
I think basically what happened there, this was true in the eyes of a lot of the media. This was certainly true in the eyes of Republicans, was Bill Clinton came to office probably at that point the least trusted incoming president we'd ever seen. The Slick Willie nickname, stuck to him in 1992. There was this sense that he was a fundamentally dishonest guy. And that, it was a certain kind of dishonesty too. There was a precision to it often. That if he might be saying something that was very, very technically, if you parsed it all out, true or accurate, but it was entirely misleading. It was entirely deceptive. And that was the sense. There's a sense that he was hiding something. And Hillary Clinton, too, was very, from the very beginning, and has predated the presidency, was very distrustful of the media in particular. So they brought that with them, and those suspicions were already on them when they got there. And so when something like you showed there with the Travel Office, well, what the heck is the Travel Office? Nobody even knows. They fire the Travel Office staff. This is, May 1993. The Travel Office is this obscure, White House office. It deals with the press as makes their arrangements.
Kind of the worst people to pick on if the press are the people who put them on 747s, feed them, and find them the best hotels around the world.
Right. They're these anonymous folks, but the press knows them. They deal with the press. They have relationships with the press. Right. And so the press knows who these people are, and it's very suspicious because who goes after the Travel Office? And then they're alleging, Dee Dee Myers and the Clinton White House is alleging all of this gross wrongdoings, and then the press starts looking into it, starts picking apart the story, and there's a lot more to it. Turns out Hillary Clinton was a driving force behind it. And then you say, the First Lady was a driving force behind going after the Travel Office, and then the White House lies about that. So that now all of that suspicion that was already there is compounded, and it's over what? It's over the Travel Office. And then, as you mentioned, there's the Vince Foster suicide, Deputy White House Counsel, summer of 1993. And who was Foster? Well, he was from the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock with Hillary Clinton. And Whitewater's becoming a source. Whitewater's already been introduced at that point. And there's all these suspicions around the Clintons. And now, well, wait a minute, didn't he have all the Whitewater records? And so there's suspicions around that start to percolate, that start to build. It turns out that somebody else from the White House went into Vince Foster's office hours after the suicide. And then, what was he doing there? Was that an innocent thing? Was he just trying to help investigators, or So all these suspicions are there, and basically in early 1994, the political pressure builds, and it even includes
White
Democrats.
House counsel Bernie Nussbaum.
It was Bernie Nussbaum who did that. That's correct. And in early 1994, the bipartisan pressure builds. You've got Democrats like Daniel Patrick Moynihan from New York who join in and say, we need a special counsel. We need, and so initially, it's like we have now with the Mueller investigation. The Justice Department, Janet Reno, the Attorney General, appoints a special counsel.
Fisk and then Ken
Fisk. But what happens too is there's this movement at the same time in Congress to say, you know what, that old independent counsel statute that they had back during in the wake of Watergate, let's bring that back. It had lapsed. Let's bring that back. And Clinton doesn't want it, but you got to say you're for it. So they're for it too. It gets through Congress. And then it's that summer Okay, Fisk is the special counsel. Janet Reno's appointed Fisk to be the special counsel. The assumption is she will make him the independent counsel. He's already put a preliminary report out. It doesn't actually sound like it's going to be that bad, for the Clintons if this guy stays on the job. And that is when the 3-judge panel has got to make the pick here. Reno recommends Fisk, but the 3-judge panel has got to make the pick, and the 3-judge panel comes up with Ken Starr. And Ken Starr, the newly revived independent counsel statute, this can be as expansive an investigation as he wants. The budget is limitless. The portfolio is limitless. And now Ken Starr is in that job, and the rest is history, as they say.
The rest is history. Divided government, tribal government, one arm of government investigating another, heading into a presidential election with an incumbent president presumably running for re-election. If we go back and look at 1996, 2004, 2012, these similar year precedents, what do the lessons of the 1990s prepare us for what's ahead?
The clear re-election lesson, for Bill Clinton was that he found his footing only when Republicans got control of Congress, only after the Republican Revolution of 1994. And it was, in a way, he benefited from the same thing that Gingrich always thought Republicans would benefit from, and that was contrast. And that was Gingrich's, plan, as I just said, on his way up and the Republican Party's way up in Congress. It was to create this very clear and stark contrast between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And in 93 and 94, for all sorts of reasons, we're just discussing the brewing Whitewater scandal, the sense that Clinton was dishonest, pushing through a tax hike in 93, having Hillary Clinton oversee health care and having that blow up. Bill Clinton's popularity really falls, and Republicans it's a tsunami, a political tsunami in 1994. Well, okay, now that you have Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House coming in 95, the equation changes. And now there's a contrast. As I say, people are just learning about Newt Gingrich for the first time. And voters, this was true particularly of suburban voters. We talk about them a lot now. We talk about, college-educated suburbanites fleeing the Republican Party. This, I think, is when it really begins. It's the mid-1990s. And these are voters who had gone for Reagan. They'd gone for Bush Sr. They'd definitely gone for Nixon. On pocketbook issues, they considered themselves Republicans. But they were culturally moderate, culturally liberal Republicans. And they'd been comfortable with a Ronald Reagan. And they look up and they see Newt Gingrich, this guy from Georgia, and he's surrounded by Southern Republicans. That was kind of new at that point, believe it or not. And there's this alliance with evangelical Christians, and he wants to shut the government down over Medicare, and that really helped Bill Clinton find his footing, being the guy who was standing against that. And you see it in the 1996 election results. He won re-election pretty easily. And it was, look at it on paper, it looked about the same as 1992. When you went into the individual states, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Illinois, the Pacific Coast, the places we now think of as blue America, that's where the big movement was. That's where you had the biggest defections from the Republicans to the Democrats. And that was the backbone of Clinton's reelection. And it's something we've been talking about really for a generation since. Democrats have had their eye on that demographic ever since. And in some ways, it was in the 2018 midterms that it finally really, came to fruition for them.
So as we look to 2019 and 2020, is there a solve for the president having now a foil a mile away at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue plus 57 million Twitter followers?
Well, I mean, that is still, and that certainly was coming off the 2018 election, what I was looking for. We're seeing our first test of it, though, and it's so far playing out differently than it did in 1995. Bill Clinton versus Newt Gingrich, government shutdown. The politics immediately worked against Gingrich and the Republicans. They pretty quickly relented. Gingrich was certainly trying to get them to relent pretty quickly. Clinton's approval rating started to climb by the end of 1995. Again, he had been wiped out in the 94 midterms. It was taken as a given that he was a one-term president. The question was, would he run for re-election or would he just be voted out by the public? Or would a Democrat take the nomination from him? A year later, end of 1995, he's winning the politics of the shutdown. His approval rating is clearing 50%. He's suddenly in good shape to win re-election. Okay, well, we're 3 weeks and counting now into the shutdown of Donald Trump versus Nancy Pelosi. Trump's approval rating, it's not crashing, but it's not climbing. It's down a couple points. It's not helping him. There's no indication in the polling that it's helping him. No indication in the polling it's helping his party. There's a question of how much will it hurt him. But if you're looking for something that was going to change the political equation in the way that the Republican Congress changed the political equation for Bill Clinton, There's no evidence right now in this showdown that it's changed the equation in Trump's favor. At best for him, it looks like a continuation of the last 2 years. At worst, it looks like it's heading south for him.
When we come back, we talk more about 2019 and 2020, informed by the 1990s and Steve Kornacki's journey from Boston to 30 Rock. That's right, after this.
Arlo's a next-generation smart home company that provides a super simple do-it-yourself home security solution with up to 48% market share and class-leading internet technology. We're looking at new products and even grow internationally. The NYSE obviously has a tremendous history. The way that they actually bring the stock to market, there was a human element that stabilizes the market. And you could see that in the stock opening today. Having a strong partnership to actually bring Arlo as a public company was really important to us. You only get to do this once.
Back now with Steve Kornacki, national political correspondent for MSNBC and NBC News and author of The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism. Before the break, we were on a nostalgic time trip through the Bush 41 and Clinton years, leading up to that moment where, Steve, you start your book, November 7th, 2000. Dan Rather interrupting Mike Wallace, Tom Brokaw muzzling Doris Kearns Goodwin with, as you report, 2 stops and 5 Dorises. A tied presidential election. As the 90s end, did we reach full tribal warfare broken only by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, that was, I mean, that's the title of the book. I mean, obviously we all now talk about red states, blue states, red America, blue America. And I think the thing that I have found just going around talking about this book, there is a sense that we've always been dealing with this. We've always lived in the America of red and blue, and it's basically a 20-year-old concept. It's basically a 2-decade, less really. It's a 19-year-old concept at this point. And it's a product of that election night 2000 and the 36 days that followed, the recount of, and that election night itself, I should say, is, I believe, the product of the 1990s. It's the product of Newt versus Bill and everything that came with that, and the divergence of the two political parties under them. And you look up on election night 2000, and you're not just seeing the closest presidential election we'd had in a generation, but it was. Not since 1976 had you had one that was at all suspenseful on election night. But the pattern that emerged, basically the entire South, once Florida was finally called, the entire South is Republican red. The Northeast, minus New Hampshire, by about 4,000 votes, I think it was in New Hampshire, the entire Northeast is blue. The Pacific Coast is blue. The interior is red. It's the basic pattern that we know today. And that's the other thing, was that the colors were random. There was no significance at all to red and blue for the two parties. They had been in the past
gone back and forth depending on what the set designer decided.
Random things. One clip I found I always remember was at the start of election night 1984. This is Reagan versus Mondale. This David Brinkley on ABC says, and we've got this map behind us, and you'll see tonight that the Republicans are red, and we've chosen that because red and Reagan start with the same letter. That's the level of thought that went into this stuff. It just so happened all the networks were on that same scheme, red for the Republicans, blue for the Democrats, going into election night 2000. And then that map, you're just watching it all night, fill in one state after the other. You see those patterns, and then the whole country is just left to stare at it, for more than a month, because this presidential race is unresolved. And it was during that David Letterman, on the Late Show on CBS, he had this joke one night where he said, we've got this Bush-Gore impasse here. Good news, America, I think I solved it. We're going to let Al Gore be president of those blue states, George W. Bush be president of those red states. And it was sort of a novel concept, but you could see this, it was sinking in with people then. And new states have kind of emerged on both sides as targets since 2000, but it's the most stable. You look back over the last 2 decades, it's really the most stable the electoral map has ever been overall. Those same basic patterns have stayed in place from that night.
The networks themselves didn't know what to do with what they were handed at 11 o'clock that night.
There was really no precedent for it. And again, you think about what had come before that immediately. Clinton in 96 was a very easy re-election, for him, just in terms of that night. A short night for the networks. 92 was momentous. You had a transfer of power from one party to the other, but it wasn't close. And in the 80s, you had, Reagan winning 44 states in 1980, 49 in 84, Bush, winning 40 in 88. I mean, these were just landslides. They were used to killing time from like 8:30 on election night. And in 2000, it was all suspense. Then you add into that, there were all sorts of errors. The other thing that strikes me, too, that I've just noticed going around looking at this too, it just, I guess, from my standpoint, I remember it vividly. There is a generation I'm seeing that's kind of coming up now that doesn't remember that night. Because I remember the before and after. I remember the America of the 90s when this stuff was taking shape. I remember a little bit of the America of the late 80s. But I can remember what it was like before we talked about red states and blue states and after. And it just really struck me going around talking about this book that there's a generation coming up now that's only known in their entire lives red and blue as a reality.
Take us behind your process. I mean, Tim Russert's whiteboards seem quaint compared to the data and technology that you and John King have at your fingertips. How does it all unfold for you on either the week and then the hours leading up to polls closing?
I guess I use 2016 as an example here because there's an election night that's a lot like 2000 in that, the total suspense. 2004 was kind of like that, but 2016, I think, because the outcome was so unexpected. You go into the night. Obviously, I have looked at every poll we've seen all year, and so I have a set of expectations in my head, and I have a set of things that I'm looking for. You've looked at every poll all year. Personally, I have just done my best to make sure in any state or any area that might possibly be critical at some point on election night that I am ready to just look at that state and say something intelligent about the political geography of the state compared to the results that are coming in. So I've done that. I'm ready for that. And the first thing that happens for us is at 5 o'clock, we get the first round of exit polls. And obviously, how do these match up against our assumptions? And in 2016, they were right where our assumptions were. It looked just like the polling before Election Day. So you take that, and you get the early results that start to come in on election night. And in 2016, again, the early results were matching up with that. I remember being at the board probably 7:30 or so at night and looking at Florida. And you've got all of Florida except the Panhandle is closed at that point. So you can't really characterize it on the air, but you can show people what's happening. And I looked at the big three Democratic counties, Broward, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and they were coming in. A lot of the vote was there. Clinton was getting a higher percentage of the vote than Barack Obama had gotten 4 years earlier, and she seemed to be getting better turnout than Obama had. And the exit polls suggested Florida was looking okay for Clinton. The pre-election polls had looked pretty good for her there. So in my head, it's now 7:45 at night, and this looks exactly like it's kind of looked all fall. And it was in the next, I'm going to say 15 to 20 minutes that it all changed. And what happened was, especially it was the counties in Florida first. That's where I first noticed it. In Florida, it was the counties on the Gulf Coast. You started to see, okay, Clinton's outperforming Obama a little down here. Trump is outperforming Romney a lot. And these are some big counties, just right north of Tampa, for instance, outperforming Romney a lot. In the turnout, this is an even bigger jump here. And the statewide lead suddenly, Clinton had been winning by 110,000 votes. The next time I check, it's down to 4,000. You're starting to see it. And then I say to myself, wait a minute, look at these Gulf Coast counties. Who lives here? These are retirees from the upper Midwest, from the industrial states. These are Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. This is where they live, the Gulf Coast. So if you're seeing it here, are we actually going to see it up there? And then I'm going into North Carolina. And I remember North Carolina, Clinton had an early lead. Now Trump's pulled ahead. Now
she and Bon Jovi were there just hours earlier, making their last.
Yeah, they thought they might have a shot in. They might have a shot in North Carolina. And no, now Trump's ahead comfortably in North Carolina. And then look in Virginia, Clinton's ahead, but we thought this is a double-digit Clinton state. Tim Kaine's on the ticket with her, and Virginia hasn't even been called. And it was a very rapid sequence of events. And what I can tell you is, from about I'm going to say 8:30 until 2:30 in the morning, it's one of the few times in my life I can remember the things that happened. I can't remember the sequence. This was 10 o'clock. This was 11 o'clock. It's a blur because so much was happening so quickly, and it was challenging so many assumptions we had about how the night was going to go. I was moving at a faster speed, I think, mentally than I'd ever been asked to move before. It was an exciting thing to be a part of, just in terms of trying to tell that story. But I do remember sometime about 2:30, things finally calmed down enough, and it was like, I remember we were just hanging on Wisconsin, and we knew where it was going to go. We were just waiting for our decision desk to call it, and that's when I could calm down and sort of start processing things again. But it was, I've never had an experience like that on air.
Steve, you're so different than the average panel of pundits who are so quick to bash us over the head with an opinion, or more subtly wink at us with a little aside on how we should think. With you, it's just the facts.
Appreciate you saying that, and that's what I try to be. And I think the answer is just from my standpoint, I'm doing elections. And whatever side of the aisle you're on, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're something else, everybody, it's one of those things you always like, I think you ask people what they want in coverage and they answer kind of aspirationally. And, we only want the issues, we want policy, and those things are very important, and there are people out there who are excellent at covering it, and there's definitely an audience for it. But it's always struck me for a long time when I'm just talking to people socially, people I know, people I don't know, I just happen to encounter, and they find out what I do for a living, they're always asking me who's winning, who's losing. Whatever side they're on, they have an interest in it. Voters on all sides are invested in who wins and who loses for all sorts of reasons. And so my role, I've always said, is trying to facilitate that conversation. It's not just who's winning and who's losing, but what is the campaign looking at right now? They're spending a fortune on polling. Okay, well, here's what we think the polling is showing. They're going after this group of voters because, well, this is what the polling is showing. They're worried about this group of voters. So trying to make people understand, the campaigns, they are so fixated on the kinds of things that I'm trying to cover on the air. I view my role as trying to bring that to some daylight, and then just trying to facilitate a conversation with people. I develop in my own head a set of expectations. They're changing constantly, often, but I'm not there to say on the air, I have looked at the numbers and there is a 96.3% chance that this is going to happen. I'm not looking to do that. I'm looking, I think, more to facilitate a conversation. And I think it's like, I hope if I'm doing it right, I can say the same things to a group of Democrats that I can say to a group of Republicans. And I found that to be the case. And I found that, just for me, again, personally, I found that in this moment in our political history, I've been gratified by that, if that's the right word. I feel like I've kind of found a little island where maybe you could still get the two sides together and you can speak the same language, have the same conversation. And the more I've kind of seen that, I found value in it, and I want to maintain it.
I want to go back to a part of your life when you might have felt that it was okay to take a side because the person that you were liking was actually kind of in the middle. You grew up outside of Boston like me. We mentioned earlier our senator in the 1980s was Paul Tsongas, self-styled pro-business guy. Let's hear one of his ads when he ran for president in 1992.
He's no movie star, but Paul Tsongas is something else. When no one thought Chrysler could survive, Paul Tsongas forced the agreement in Congress that saved 100,000 jobs. When special interests were grabbing up our last great wilderness, Paul Tsongas pushed through what has been called the conservation bill of the century. And while others feared the president's popularity, Paul Tsongas took him on with a new economic vision for America, getting the tough jobs done. It's called leadership, paid for by the Tsongas Committee.
You said here, and you said in a recent article, that he was the best friend Wall Street ever had. 30 years later, we forget about people like Bob Michael, just right of center, Tsongas just left of center. But now that we're sitting here on Wall Street, what was his appeal to a kid like you?
For me, it was really specific. In 1991, when he got in the presidential race, I turned 12 years old that year. I grew up, he's from Lowell, Massachusetts, which is a old mill town, about 25 miles northwest of Boston. I'm from outside of Lowell. I'm from a town outside of Lowell. He was a giant in our area. He was a giant in our area because he'd made it big in politics, sort of as an underdog, but also because he had kept such deep roots in the area and in Lowell. And in Lowell, it was going through particularly tough times in the 70s, in the 80s, and he did an incredible amount of work to bring resources into that city, to bring businesses into that city.
Wang,
Wang's the big one. And people now probably say, what's Wang? Right. Wang in the 80s was cutting edge. The Wang Country Club was in the town I grew up in, where they had their employee country club. I remember that. But yeah, he brought public money in there to get a national park designation. Was instrumental in bringing business in there. He had left the Senate diagnosed with cancer in 1984. It sounded like a death sentence at the time. At the early 1990s, he's still around. He's healthy. He's swimming. Seems healthy. It was more complicated, it turned out. And he gets in the presidential race as George H.W. Bush has just won the Gulf War, 91% approval rating, and Tsongas gets in the race. And I just remember this is 4 years after Dukakis. All the jokes about another Greek from Massachusetts, just that's what Democrats are really looking for, right? And he caught fire. You heard it in that ad there. He's not a movie star. And he's running against Bill Clinton, who is as smooth as they come.
He's got sort of a squeaky voice.
Yeah, and that became his lack of charisma was his charisma because it read against Clinton as authenticity. You got Slick Willie, that's the image of Bill Clinton, and you got this totally like non-telegenic guy, Paul Tsongas, who's got this 85-page booklet on economics he wants to hand out to you. It was like the contrast, image-wise, was so stark. And then against the odds, he gets traction. He wins the New Hampshire primary, he wins Maryland. There's a moment there when it looks like this guy actually knock off Clinton, win the nomination. There's polls that at that point show him beating Bush. Could this guy actually be president? And I just remember, I bring the youthful political nerd's perspective to it, I guess. I just remember the excitement where I grew up as he caught fire. I remember they chartered buses on weekends. You could go down to Maryland and campaign for him. It was in the Lowell Sun newspaper, which is a very conservative newspaper, but they loved Paul Tsongas. They were totally on board. So you get that newspaper, we get that afternoon newspaper every day, and you're just, it wasn't Democrat, Republican, left, or I couldn't even really explain a lot of the agenda. But he just seemed like a really good guy, and he was from our area, and it was one of the most exciting things to watch for a while.
So for you, after college at BU, it was on to exploring opportunities in LA. You had ambitions to make a tidy living gaming the game shows. Explain.
I wish I could explain. It was a whim. After college, I had some friends who were going out to Los Angeles trying to do film, television stuff. I said I'd go with him. I said I planned to go very short term. What I really wanted to do was drive around the country, and I kind of felt, well, this is drive across the country. I said, this is a good chance I'm ever going to have. So I went with them, thinking I'll stay, maybe a couple of days and come back. I ended up staying a little longer because I got out there and I was like, I used to watch these game shows on TV. I always thought I might be okay on them, and this is where they tape them all. So let me see if I can get on one or two of these, and if I can win, I could survive for a little while out here, and then who knows? That was to the extent there was a plan. That's what I tried. I basically struck out even trying to get on them. I think I was about to make it. If people remember the show Win Ben Stein's Money, it was on Comedy Central, and then the show got canceled. So they called me back.
You never got your shot?
Never. I think I was going to get it, and they called me back one day, and they say, "Yeah, we're going off the air. There's not going to be another season." So that wasn't in the cards. I taped a pilot for one. I think the show aired on USA briefly, but yeah, I never got the big bucks game show career I was expecting out of that.
So you trudge your way back across the country. You find yourself in New Jersey, of all places, covering politics. You burst on the scene really in September 2013 when 2 of the 3 toll lanes of the George Washington Bridge were mysteriously closed during rush hour. Here's New Jersey Governor Chris Christie explaining himself.
Has certainly tested this administration. Mistakes were clearly made, and as a result, we let down the people we're entrusted to serve. I know our citizens deserve better, much better. Now, I'm the governor, and I'm ultimately responsible for all that happens on my watch, both good and bad. Now, without a doubt, we will cooperate with all appropriate inquiries to ensure that this breach of trust does not happen again.
What put you in the middle of the story?
It stems from covering New Jersey, and I covered politics in New Jersey at a pretty local level. It was statewide, but it was sort of, we were kind of covering the politics of politics. So I'm covering, I'm going one day I'm in South Jersey talking about a big county race down there. The next day I'm in Bergen County, and so I got to know just all of the sort of behind the scenes people throughout the state in New Jersey politics, got to know a lot of the politicians. And it put me in position where it turned out the mayor of Hoboken, a city right across the Hudson River from New York City, in the wake of the story you're talking about right there, felt like she had been threatened by the Christie administration and wanted to come forward and make the accusation and make her case. And I was at MSNBC at that point, and I had the Saturday morning show. She showed me all of her materials. We were able to go check them out. We're not just putting her on the air to say things that she doesn't have supporting material for. You can make of what she was saying what you wanted, but we put that story out there. That was in early 2014, and that was on the MSNBC Weekend Show.
I mean, when Christie won re-election, I can actually still see his acceptance speech. You thought, for all intents and purposes, he was the presumptive Republican nominee in 2016, not Donald Trump.
What do I know? What does anybody know? We're always wrong about everything. I have, my gut for whatever it's worth, is that Christie, absent that scandal at the end in 2013, there may not have been a Trump who even emerged. And I know all the arguments that are made, like why Christie was, unelectable, unnominatable in the Republican Party. People make them with a lot of conviction, and I always come back at them and I say, look at Donald Trump. Look at how many things Donald Trump had on his record, things he said that you were programmed to say, you cannot say this and win the Republican nomination for president. Donald Trump campaigned for president saying, at one point he said that George W. Bush lied us into Iraq. Right, like somebody on the far left is going to say, if you would just sit in the abstract and a Republican presidential candidate say that in South Carolina and win every congressional district in South Carolina in the primary, you'd say, of course not. Well, Trump did. So Trump tested a lot, and I think what was key for Trump was the personality. It was the whatever you want to call it, swagger, the posture, and Christie had a lot of that.
Christie had that swagger that would get me and my wife, moderate Democrats thinking about coming over.
That's the
practical, common sense, good government.
And there's the difference between that Christie and Trump, is that Christie could get buy-in from the Republican establishment. He could sell that demeanor, that posture, that these fools don't know what they're doing. I'm going to go. A lot of that is what Trump tapped into, but the establishment in the Republican Party, when they thought he was electable, would have been happy to go along with it. And I think he could have put together a coalition there, a very powerful coalition that spoke sufficiently to that rest of grassroots base that got behind Trump, but that didn't, while doing that, freak out the establishment the way Trump did. And I'm not sure, Jeb certainly couldn't do it, but Christie wasn't. You saw a little bit of it. If people remember the New Hampshire primary debate the Saturday night before, and Christie at that point knows,
moderating.
Yeah, and Christie at that point, it's not going to be me. It's just not. It's not happening. But he was so mad. He believed he had a chance until Marco Rubio, folks around him had gone after him in December 2015. And you can see Christie's basically saying to himself, it's not going to be me, but by God, it's not going to be Rubio. And he goes after Rubio in that debate, and Rubio unravels. And it was an amazing thing to see. And it's one of those what ifs. You look back at the 2016 Republican primaries and you said, geez, if that didn't happen, Rubio, did he have a little bit of momentum there heading into New Hampshire? Would he have been a lot closer to Trump primary night in New Hampshire? Would that have gotten Jeb Bush out of the race? Would there have been some consolidation around Rubio coming out of New Hampshire if that doesn't happen? Did Christie alter things? You could play all the different what ifs out, but all I would say is what you saw there was that political talent. You got a little taste of it right there from Chris Christie, and I think that guy, unburdened by the scandal that affected him so much, I wonder if Trump even just doesn't see the opening that he saw.
So from New Jersey, you mentioned you were at MSNBC when Bridgegate broke. It brought you across the Hudson to MSNBC, a change from some of the hosts of old at that network, people like Alan Keyes, Pat Buchanan, a new generation of millennials, The Cycle with Crystal Ball, Touré, S.E. Cupp, and you. Let's have a listen to the beginning of one of your commentaries back then.
I am a sucker for traditions, especially quirky traditions. The running of the Bulls, the green jacket in the Masters, that thing in Detroit where fans of the Red Wings throw octopuses or octopi or whatever it is on the ice during playoff games. Back where I grew up in Massachusetts, there's a group of old men who celebrate every New Year's Day by putting on their bathing suits and jumping into the freezing cold Atlantic Ocean because, well, just because. And I think it's great. But in politics, there's one quirky tradition that I really don't like: the Electoral College.
The Electoral College, Steve, it's Donald Trump's favorite subject. Every last one of the 304 votes he won. You still hold your view as the race to 270 starts to heat up with a basketball team's worth of Democrats already forming their exploratory committees that you don't like the Electoral College?
It's an interesting one, and I'll tell you, it grows out of, I've always been fascinated with the Electoral College, and try to go back to before the 2000 election when in modern times we hadn't had that situation where one candidate wins the popular vote and loses the Electoral College. It hadn't had that since the 19th century. So it was a what if. How would modern American politics handle it if that ever happened? And it was an open question. Nobody really knew. And you can go back and you can find news clippings from late 2000. The expectation was if it happened on election night 2000, it would be the opposite. It was going to be Bush who won the popular vote and Gore who won the Electoral College. And the Bush campaign, there's news reports from back then, was getting ready for that and was going to fight it. Was going to try to, there'd be a group called Democrats for Democracy and whatever it was. And I just remember, I always believed, my sense in the 90s was if it ever happened, the country wouldn't stand for it. And obviously it was proven wrong by the 2000 election. But I remember coming out of the 2000 election and thinking there's a solution here that seems pretty obvious that merges the two. Because I get the benefits people argue for at the Electoral College, and it's the idea of the congressional district-based vote. How do you apportion the Electoral College, right? It's a vote for every district in the state plus two at-large, for the senators for winning the state at-large. Maine does this right now. Nebraska, we saw Maine split. Clinton wins one district, Trump wins one district, Clinton wins the state, she gets two. It's 3-1 was the vote in Maine. I always said, why don't you do that for the presidential election? The states still matter. There's still some autonomy to the states. It is still possible you're going to have the president who loses the popular vote and wins the Electoral College, but I think it becomes far less likely. Right, in California, Texas. It's more precise. I think it still rewards the autonomy of the states and there's the state strategy and all of that. Now that it has happened twice, where the same party's benefited and the same party's been on the losing side of it, to change it in any way, it's got to happen the other way. The Democrats lose the popular vote, win the presidency. Then I think maybe you could get what you need, which is buy-in from both parties to say, okay, let's rethink this. Let's do this a different way. But yeah, I think right now it's an academic discussion because it's not going to change once they're so locked in each side right now.
I want to see a 70s book from you, an 80s book from you, a 2010s book from you. Can you do it?
Boy, I'm looking for. I want to do another one. I loved writing this book. I really did. It was my escape in the last couple of years from the 24/7 news cycle. Got to live in the 90s basically again. I'd love to do that. 70s is cool. I've been thinking more modern, but 70s, I kind of like that.
Come on, Shaft.
There's some fun stuff. There's some gas lines.
Nixon,
Disco,
Carter, Ford. Thanks so much, Steve, for joining us.
Thank you. This was fantastic. Thank you.
That's our conversation for this week. Our guest was Steve Kornacki, national political correspondent for MSNBC and NBC News, and now author of The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism. If you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks know where to find us. And if you've got a comment or a question you'd like one of our experts to tackle in a future show, email us at icehouse@theice.com or tweet at us at NYSE. Our show is produced by Pete Ash and Ian Wolfe with production assistance from Ken Abel and Stephen Portner. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the Library of the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.